Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are recapping the Austria Grand Prix. This race weekend was filled with teammate battles, battles between drivers and their engineers, and battles between teams and their own cars. We have a lot to cover, so let's just jump right into it. As always, we'll talk about stuff that was going on before the race weekend started, things that happened during free practice and qualifying, and of course the race itself. And we'll end by answering any of the questions that you guys sent in for the race this week, as well as your hot takes and predictions for next week. So let's just dive right in. If you listened to the race week preview that I put out on Thursday, you may know some of this information already, but in case you need a refresher, heading into this race weekend, we were looking at Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris's championship battle, how the team would handle these two teammates after Lando Norris ended his own race by crashing into Oscar in Montreal, whether we were going to see team orders or anything like that, or whether these drivers would be free to race, and if they were free to race, what both of these drivers would bring to the track this weekend. Additionally, we saw Carlos Sainz's father announce that he was no longer going to be seeking a bid towards the FIA presidency, citing that after doing a lot of research into the state of the FIA and what would be required, it did not feel like the right time for him to continue his bid. Additionally, he referenced his ability to prepare for the Dakar Rally properly, which he is already set to do with Ford. All of that being said, it does look like the current president of the FIA will actually be running unopposed, which basically means we most likely will not see a lot of changes from the FIA moving forward. However, one of the things that we did see from the FIA heading into this race weekend was that they decided to put out a reference document of what the stewards are given for guidelines. This document actually referenced almost 100 different infractions that could be given to a driver, as well as the penalties that would be associated with them. A lot of that seemed to be in reference to this idea of transparency and the fact that the FIA doesn't always seem to have some. And it was an interesting thing for us to see as fans, because this is the first time that those reference points have been released to the public. And that means that it's also the first time that we're able to see how they make these decisions. And it's an interesting thing because oftentimes, especially when we're doing these recaps, we spend a lot of times talking about whether or not somebody should have received the penalty that they did, whether it felt like someone was being treated unfairly or two incidents were not being treated equally, and also whether certain drivers are favored by the FIA or not. Now, this is a conversation that happens in all sports. You're always going to hear it like an NFL game or an NBA game that, oh, these refs were totally slated towards the other team. And as much as possible, all of the referees in those leagues are slated to be kind of impartial. In American football, for example, especially in college football, you actually cannot referee a game where your college, like your alma mater, is playing in, and you can't referee games that are in your hometown. Those are just a couple of references that show that we see that these are supposed to be unbiased judges. But with the FIA, we really don't have a lot of that same transparency that we have in other sports. And so putting this document out was kind of an interesting step in that direction. Whether or not fans feel that the document is always followed to the letter, or that these stewards are always fair and equal, it is still a step in the right direction of us trying to be able to see how these decisions are supposed to be made. And potentially it could be a step towards a little bit more transparency from the FIA as a whole. We've talked about this before, especially in reference to driver fines, because we've seen that drivers have been fined, but we also don't know, and neither do the drivers, where any of that money actually goes. Other leagues actually specify where that money goes, as well as the charities that they support, whereas the FIA seems to take these fines and just own the money for themselves. Again, this concept of transparency with the FIA has been a conversation for a large portion of this year alone, and so it's interesting to see them take some steps in a different direction. Outside of that, heading into this race weekend, we also knew that Ferrari were bringing upgrades. And I will say it was interesting because heading into the weekend on Media Day, we saw both Ferrari drivers, Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc, state that they weren't sure that these upgrades were really going to be a positive. And we'll get into why those drivers were actually wrong, which is interesting. We also know that Charles Leclerc was asked about the 2026 car and the fact that he had been on the simulator for it, and he very much said that it was not a fun car to drive and that if things don't change, he doesn't think he will have fun driving it next year. So there was sort of this grim outlook on the weekend coming from both Ferrari drivers moving forward, and we also saw that the team principal, Fred Vasseur, had to leave early from this race weekend for personal reasons. So all signs were kind of pointing to not a great weekend and potentially not a great 2 years for Ferrari as we started this race weekend. In other points, we also saw that George Russell was coming off of a race win and that Kimi Antonelli himself had also had his very first podium, and so there was a little bit of hope that Mercedes might continue to see strong performance this weekend. The other big talking point that we saw coming out of Media Day is really this start to silly season. If this is your first season watching Formula One, silly season is the term we reference when we're talking about driver contracts for next year. At a certain point in the season, drivers who are not committed for next year's season start to have conversations about where they may have a seat, whether they're going to renew with the team that they're at, or whether there are spaces for them elsewhere. Last year, the biggest driver topic of silly season was Carlos Sainz when he was leaving Ferrari. We had so many points of where is he going, what teams is he going to be available for, and where will he he end up? And then this long saga of Williams really trying to court him. That was even kind of clarified in Drive to Survive this season, where we saw the fact that he was supposed to sign his Williams contract and backed out. We saw James Vowles kind of depressingly waiting for him in a hotel room that he never shows up to. And then we also find out that Carlos was very much approached by Alpine and Flavio Briatore, and that was a conversation that he was willing to entertain. As we all know, he ultimately ended up with Williams for this season, but that was like this big conversation for silly season. And it seems like starting this weekend, we're starting to get those big conversations again. And the big storyline that came out of this weekend was George Russell, Max Verstappen, and Mercedes. We know for a fact that Toto Wolff has tried to get Max Verstappen over to Mercedes twice, and he has not been able to do so either time. But now that Lewis Hamilton has moved on and gone to Ferrari, we have a driver lineup of George Russell and Kimi Antonelli. Kimi Antonelli is on a rookie contract, which generally only guarantees you your first season with an option for you to be picked up afterwards, and George Russell's contract ends at the end of this season, which is why he has started to be asked about why he doesn't have a renewal contract for next season. Especially after his win in Canada, we started to see people expect to see that contract renewed, and if it wasn't renewed, there was a reason why. The reason why would be one of two things. George Russell was either talking to another team that he was interested in, or Mercedes was looking at other drivers that they were interested in. And this week, when George was asked about why his contract hadn't been renewed, or if he was starting to get worried, he said that his focus is on performing at the best of his abilities. This season, he needs to continue to win, and he needs to continue to do as best as he can with the car that he has. And if he's performing, then he shouldn't have anything else to worry about. However, he also brings into the conversation the idea that Mercedes is talking to Max. He says that it's only natural that they would do so, but he also sort of implies that as long as he does a good job, why does he care? And mentions that there are 2 seats at Mercedes. After these comments, Toto Wolff was asked about it as well, and did confirm that of course they would want to talk to Max Verstappen, but also said that George would of course be on their radar for someone that they wanted to continue to work with, given that he's a race winner and that he has been with Mercedes for as long as he has. But the interesting conundrum that kind of comes out of this is if Max is able to get out of his contract at Red Bull and decides to head over to Mercedes, as George said, there's only 2 seats. And while George's point was that there are 2 seats available, meaning that even if they get Max, he could still stay at Mercedes, the real question is, if you get Max Verstappen, who do you sacrifice? George Russell or Kimi Antonelli? And in that dynamic, who becomes the prioritized driver and who's willing to be a second driver? How long is that period of time for? All of these are really big questions that come up if these conversations are legitimate. And so that is shaping up to be our biggest silly season news of the season so far. In silly season news, we also have Valtteri Bottas kind of hinting at this idea that he may be one of the Cadillac drivers. He posted a video to social media walking up to a Cadillac, and they were asked if he wanted to take a seat, and he kind of deadpans into the camera and says, not yet. But Valtteri also loves to make a joke and play into fan behavior, I have to be honest with you. This is a man that we are talking about who has an entire calendar just of his butt, which he sold for charity. So the idea that he may be kind of playing with fan emotions, playing with fan engagement is not super far out of line. Personally, I would love to see him back in a Formula One seat outside of being a reserve driver. So if Cadillac has called him, they're going to have at least one big fan in me. Other rumors surrounding Cadillac include Checo Perez, Pato O'Ward, Daniel Ricciardo, pretty much anyone with a pulse that people miss and want to see in Formula One. And then on Media Day, we also have Lando Norris addressing the situation with Oscar Piastri and the way that the team handled it after Montreal. As we all know, Lando took that kind of dive move. I talked a lot about what I thought that would look like for the rest of the season last week, but we saw Lando and Oscar both address the situation in media this week, as we knew they would be asked to do. Lando said that of course the conversations were not comfortable or nice, but that they had all kind of moved forward and put it behind them for this weekend. Oscar said that they had been told they were free to race, and of course the implication there is that you're free to race as long as you don't damage the other car or crash both of the cars off of the track. Ideally, you're free to race, but both of you should finish the race. And interestingly enough, we saw kind of a change in tune from Lando, where he basically talks about the idea that while they both have the best car, Oscar has been able to perform better, but he didn't really blame anyone but himself. He essentially said that Oscar leading him in the championship was due to the fact that Lando has simply made more mistakes than Oscar has. And this is a conversation that we've all kind of been having, but it's been interesting to see Lando directly address it heading into this race weekend, essentially saying that Oscar has simply made less mistakes than he has, and that Lando's simple mistakes, which he has been making, have been the thing to cost him points in a big way. And so as he moves forward and tries not to make those mistakes, the question will be whether or not that allows him to catch up. But hearing Lando and Oscar talk this weekend at Media Day before the race weekend even started, it was pretty clear that both of them very much have their head in the game, and that Lando has really accepted this idea that he needs to stop making simple mistakes if he wants to beat his teammate. So that kind of covers our big moments heading into the race weekend, let's talk about practice sessions and qualifying. Looking at the McLarens, we saw them both very fast. However, Lando gives his car to a rookie for free practice 1, meaning that he has one less free practice session than Oscar. But as soon as he hits the track in free practice 2 and free practice 3, we see Lando at the very top of the timesheets outperforming Oscar as well. And while we're not seeing other cars really perform at the height that they would need to be, in free practice we start to see those Ferrari upgrades performing far better than either driver implied they would. And there's a little bit of an excitement and hope from Ferrari fans that this may be a turning point. And then we get into qualifying, which was an interesting one to watch. A number of surprises come out of this qualifying session. First, we see Yuki Tsunoda get bumped out in Q1 again. And that second Red Bull seat has been one of the toughest conversations of this season, and really seasons before, as we watched it take Checo Perez apart. We watched Liam Lawson have such a tough time at the beginning of the season before being bumped back down to VCARB, and now we've been watching Yuki Tsunoda just struggle to an extreme point. Qualifying was so hard to watch because this is another Q1 knockout in a Red Bull, and this is the type of thing that it just seems to happen in this second car. Nobody can seem to get it to perform well. Both Max and Yuki were complaining about grip this entire qualifying session, and the Red Bull just seems to continue to lack the performance that it needs to have. Not only do we see Yuki get knocked out in Q1, but we also see Max very unhappy with his qualifying position in P7. We'll get into why that exactly happened when we get into the Q3 conversation, but it's overall a very disappointing qualifying session for Red Bull. The other very devastating knockout for Q1 was Carlos Sainz again getting knocked out in Q1. Nico Hülkenberg, Lance Stroll, and Esteban Ocon round out the rest of that first 5 knockout. Then in Q2, we see the other Williams knocked out with Alex Albon coming in 12th. Fernando Alonso just misses out on Q3. Franco Colapinto does make it into Q2, which is positive, especially given the way that his performance has been since he started this year, and the fact that this was technically the last race on his contract, though we have seen Alpine say that he will continue in that seat. Ollie Behrman is also knocked out in Q2, and then kind of surprisingly, we see Isaac Hadjar knocked out in Q2. And this is not only surprising given that Isaac Hadjar has had a pretty solid performance thus far this season, but it's also surprising because his teammate Liam Lawson makes it into Q3, and this is a really big deal for Liam. Because not only do we see Liam make it into Q3, we also see him out-qualify Max Verstappen. Liam ends up qualifying P6, and Max ends up qualifying P7. Now, the thing about this that is important to point out, and is kind of important for the rest of our Q3 conversation, is that Pierre Gasly in Q3 did spin out. And when he spun out, it did cause a yellow flag, which required a number of drivers to bail out on their final lap. And 2 of those drivers were Max Verstappen and Oscar Piastri. While they were not on track to actually get a pole lap from that, they were on track to improve. And so the fact that they had to bail out means that they don't qualify exactly where they would have. Liam most likely ultimately wouldn't have actually out-qualified Max had Max been able to finish his final lap. But regardless, this is how things shake out, and it actually is a really big positive for Liam, who really desperately needed a positive. And I will say it's always nice to see a driver who is so kind of beaten down week after week be able to have a little bit of positive and actually smile in their post-race press. And that's pretty much what happened. Liam ends up having a really solid race weekend in a way that he has not. And it's nice to see a kind of change in his tone and a change in the way that he feels, because it's always tough to watch a driver just get beaten down each week, regardless of whether or not they're your favorite driver. It's just never nice to see any driver or any person just be so down all the time. And so it was nice to see Liam have a positive weekend, in my opinion. Other big qualifying notes include Gabriel Bortoleto making it to Q3 for the first time, and of course, Lando Norris taking pole position by the largest margin we have seen all season. Again, it's important to point out that that is partially because of that yellow flag, but it was still a dominant performance for Lando Norris from the very beginning of this race weekend all the way through qualifying and, of course, the race itself. And lastly, you actually see those Ferraris come in 2nd and 4th for qualifying, with Oscar Piastri in between them. And so seeing the Ferraris have that kind of pace in qualifying was a huge turn for them. All of that being said, while qualifying was pretty exciting and unexpected, let's get into the race itself. Before we can even start the race, we obviously have Carlos Sainz stall out in the formation lap. As the drivers go off and start their formation lap and do the first round around the track, we see Carlos Sainz stay in his box, saying that he can't get the car out of first gear. Now, I will say when this happened, I immediately laughed and asked my dad if he thought that Sonny Hayes was back on the grid, which if you've seen the F1 movie by now, you already know the joke. And if you haven't seen the F1 movie, let's just say maybe it's not as unrealistic as everyone wants to say that it is. Obviously, what happens here is that if Carlos can't get through the formation lap in a certain amount of time, he'll have to start the race from the pit lane. And that is what happens here. Carlos isn't able to get the car off fast enough, and even though he does eventually get his car back into gear and start the formation lap, he has to head into the pit lane where he's supposed to start the race. And then we actually have a reset of the grid start, meaning that the race start is delayed by about 10 minutes because of this aborted start. But then in the pit lane, Carlos isn't even able to start the race because his rear rear brakes catch fire. At that point, we see them try to put the fire out. We see them try to get his car ready. And then eventually we get one of the most funny and also not funny radio messages from Carlos's engineer. Carlos's engineer just says, "Game over, Carlos. We're going to have to retire the car." Game over to me is one of the most flippant but hilariously everybody is so devastated messages to send when you're telling your driver they're not going to be able to race today. And unfortunately, we don't even see Williams' troubles stop there. During the race itself, we see Alex Albon also have to retire the car due to mechanical failure. And this is a really kind of devastating stretch of time for Williams. We saw them start this season out with such a strong start, finishing in the points for multiple races, having this solid start to the season, and really having a strong grip on the midfield, really sitting in that 5th position comfortably when it comes to the Constructors' Championship. But then instead, starting in Barcelona and continuing from there, we have just seen race after race of failure. We've seen them not be able to finish the race, have mechanical failures, and just ultimately really not have the pace to begin with. Their qualifying pace has dropped down extremely, and it's been overall kind of tough to watch. This is a situation where we're hoping to see this team actually continue to pull and build on it, especially with strong talent and with what felt like a pretty strong car. One thing we do know about Williams, and could be a possible source of the trouble, is that we do know that they have stopped working on upgrades for the 2025 car and instead are focusing all of their time and efforts on the 2026 car. And part of that is because they are in this solid position at P5 in the Constructors' Championship. And their resources like time, effort, money, all of those are a little bit more valuable focused on next year's car, given that the gap to get to P4 is not going to be surmountable. And they feel like they have a comfortable gap between them and P6. However, obviously with the number of DNFs and trouble in qualifying that we're seeing for both of these drivers, the number of technical issues, watching brakes on fire, one car not starting the race and the other car not even finishing the race, it's a situation where we're starting to feel like we do need to focus on whatever the issue is here. Otherwise, the rest of this season is going to be pretty tough to get through. I do feel pretty strongly that James Vowles knows what he's doing, and so that feels like there's something going on that maybe we're just not able to put our finger on, and hopefully that they'll be able to turn this around soon. Part of me feels like we won't see this turnaround at Silverstone, and then maybe with the break that we'll have after that race, we'll see them be able to fix the issue or really identify what's going on here. But it is just so genuinely tough to watch. We had this team that came out of the gate swinging in a way that we did not expect them to be able to do, and that makes the fall feel even worse because this is a team that you used to not expect very much performance from. But over the last 2 years, we have really seen them make big moves in terms of personnel and drivers, and we saw this car really have a great amount of performance at the beginning of the season. And so while I don't feel like we're necessarily going to be back to a very great place with them in Silverstone, I do hope that we will be able to see them make some changes after that and get back in the race, so to speak. And then we get into the actual race itself. We have a couple of major storylines in this race, and let's start with the actual start of the race. What I was excited about going into this race was seeing how the Ferraris actually showed up when it came to race pace. Because as we talked about, Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri didn't lock out the front row. While we had Lando Norris in pole position with this massive gap, Oscar Piastri is not in second, and instead we see Charles Leclerc line up second in that front row. And then behind them, we have Oscar Piastri in third and Lewis Hamilton in fourth. And the question really was, if we saw them get away with a good start, what would the rest of the race look like? Because the Ferrari upgrades clearly brought a lot of pace in single lap qualifying, but the real question was going to be whether or not they would actually have that pace turn into race pace. And unfortunately, when we look at the start, Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri both get away with great starts, and Charles Leclerc kind of finds himself pushed back to third. For a second, there's a little bit of a battle with George Russell and the Ferraris, but then eventually it just kind of shuffles into two separate races. At the front, we have Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri in a race completely on their own, and then behind them we have the two Ferraris that kind of maintain a good pace. But very quickly we see that gap start to open up with a really strong amount of time in between those McLarens and the people behind them. And so as the Ferraris did obviously have some upgrades that made a difference, those upgrades still have them pretty far behind the race pace of the McLarens. And so we're going to kind of divide this race up into the McLaren race and everybody else, because frankly the McLarens at no point had a concern about other drivers on the track. So we'll go through the rest of the race, kind of the field that was not the 1-2 McLarens, and talk about some of those key moments, and then we'll dive into Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. Obviously, when we talk about the start of the race, one of the things that we absolutely have to talk about is Kimi Antonelli taking himself and Max Verstappen out of the race very quickly. Essentially, we saw Kimi Antonelli attempt to avoid action from two other cars, and in that action drive straight into the middle, which then hits Max Verstappen, spinning them both off the track. At that point, we see Max have a classic Max reaction over the radio, saying that he was hit, he was out, and everyone else is an effing idiot. And so the thing about this that was very interesting and funny to me was that you see that energy coming out pretty intensely, which is classic Max. And part of the reason why people who are fans of Max is sometimes about that energy. Calling it like it is, being able able to be a little intense on the radio and everything like that. But then we see Max get out of the car and actually realize who hit him. And instead of him having this kind of like intense or semi-childish response, we instead see him take his helmet off, go over to Kimi, and try to figure out what happened in a pretty calm and collected manner. And then once he realizes that it's a pretty rookie mistake, but it is in fact a rookie mistake, we kind of see him brush the issue off. I saw a lot of press that was trying to say that this was Max like coming at him, and I also saw some other headlines that said like Max calls Kimi Antonelli an effing idiot. And it's like that is kind of actually genuinely manufactured drama. Because if you watch the race, you see Max go over, realize it's Kimi, sees this 18-year-old kid who's like brand new to the sport, beating himself up over making a stupid mistake. And then you see Max realize that, yeah, that's what it was. It was just an uneducated mistake. Kimi is so young and so new to this world. And I think one of the things that was funny about watching Max do this, it reminded me of watching Gordon Ramsay in like MasterChef Junior. Gordon Ramsay, like Max, is known for having these intense flare-ups, this intense energy when it comes to people on Hell's Kitchen or on MasterChef. Adult chefs who have real careers and should absolutely know not to make a stupid mistake. But then you watch him on MasterChef Junior and he's very kind and helping with kids. There are so many clips that go viral of Gordon Ramsay trying to help a kid calm down and recognize that it's okay to make mistakes and helping them learn from that. This was such a similar energy. You see Max off the bat irritated and upset about what happened, and then when you see him realize it was a mistake from someone who just doesn't know what they're doing yet because they are a rookie. That's why we call it a rookie mistake. You see him kind of flip that MasterChef Junior switch. It's okay, it's a rookie mistake, you apologized, it is what it is. It's an unfortunate incident, which is what Max ends up calling it later in post-race press conferences. And so with that, I actually found it pretty refreshing, and honestly, it was interesting to me because we don't necessarily look at Max as someone who is a large mentor when it comes to the future of this sport. One of the biggest issues that Red Bull has right now is this ability to find a second driver, and we see them go through young talent so quickly. We see them kind of bring someone in, decide they're not good enough, and move on. And we have never really seen Max in a position where he is trying to help someone else or trying to mentor them through, at least not in a public manner. Part of that is because the drivers that have been in his second seat previously have not necessarily been people who needed a lot of mentoring or were drivers that should have known what they were doing already. His first teammate was Daniel Ricciardo, then you also have Checo Perez, and in between there, of course, there are drivers that could have used Max's help. Alex Albon, Pierre Gasly, and that type of thing. But also Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon, Max Verstappen, they're kind of close in age, and while Max is obviously one of the top drivers in this sport, not only a reigning champion, but a 4-time world champion, it was interesting to see him for the first time really kind of feel like he was filling that older brother style role, like a senior driver that's trying to help a rookie out. I think also a lot of times we forget that Max started in Formula One when he was only 17 years old, and that he has to remember what it was like to be surrounded by people who are so much older than you, so much more experienced than you, people that you watched on television growing up, and people that are now your competitors and perhaps not the nicest when they're in a competitive situation. And so it makes sense to me that Max has a soft spot in his heart for rookies like that, especially Kimi, who's only 18 years old and very similar to Max's world where he came in as this sort of prodigy with a high level of expectation and a promising future. So to me, it made sense that we saw Max come in and just try to be a little kind. And there was one part of my brain that couldn't help but think about the rumors that we're hearing about Max heading to Mercedes. As we talked about earlier when we were talking about the pre-race rumors and the silly season situation, the question to me was, is this kind of a glimpse of what it would look like for Max and Kimi to be teammates? Would Max be able to help Kimi learn the things he needs to learn, know when to beat himself up and know when to let it go, and also be a sort of additional mentoring presence for Kimi if they were to become teammates? Again, this is all silly season rumors. This is not the first time we've heard rumor that Max is considering a move to Mercedes, but it is honestly the first time that it sounds a little legitimate. And this moment, whether it was a moment between future teammates or just a moment between a reigning world champion and a very promising young rookie, it was kind of nice in the same way that it was nice to see Isaac Hadjar comforted by Lewis Hamilton's dad. Sometimes sports are about moments like this, moments where you see someone who is maybe not known as the kindest, most fun-loving person when it comes to mistakes. Look at someone who's young, inexperienced, and a little scared, and comfort them instead of getting into a fight with them, letting them know that it's okay to make a mistake and move forward from that mistake. And so whether we ever see something like this again between the two of them, as much as it sucked to watch both of them not be able to finish this race, especially given Max's kind of standings when it comes to the championship, it was a nice moment in general. We do know that from this incident, Kimi Antonelli will be penalized in Silverstone, and that will be with a 3-place grid drop. So no matter where Kimi qualifies in Silverstone, he will drop 3 places. So if he takes pole, he would drop 3 places from that, or so on and so forth. And one other thing that this incident did mean, Max got out of this race with no penalty points, meaning that he does drop those 2 other penalty points off today and moves back into a more comfortable place, though he still has 9 penalty points to deal with for the next next 12 months. Regardless, he does avoid this race ban that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks at this point. This incident also brought out a safety car, which reset a little bit of the timing, and then we saw everybody kind of bunch back up again, as we do. And when we restart, we still see Lando Norris maintain his lead. On the Red Bull side of things, outside of Max getting taken out of the race early, Yuki Tsunoda had a poor qualifying and then kind of played bumper cars throughout the race. It was a surprisingly kind of rookie-like performance from him, because when we do see him qualify poorly, we generally still see him know how to race and behave on track. Instead, we saw him with contact and ended up finishing completely dead last in this race, as well as getting lapped twice. And the future of Yuki Tsunoda, or that Red Bull second seat in general, has just become this situation where it is so tough to watch. We've been seeing interviews with Checo Perez come out where he's finally spoken about his situation at Red Bull, and where he's made it very clear that it feels like the team is run with only one car in mind. And it's an odd situation because now we have all of these rumors that potentially Max is going somewhere else. And whether or not we see Max actually leave Red Bull for Mercedes or any other team next year, eventually Max will no longer be racing in Formula One. And eventually that means Red Bull will have to have another plan for their drivers. And so the question really becomes, if we continue to see them put so much focus on one car with no plan for the second car, and we continue to see them burn through so many drivers, where do we see them going when Max ultimately does leave? At the end of this race, we essentially saw all of the Red Bull camp say that they're not expecting Max to really have a championship possibility this year, especially given the fact that at the end of this race, he has no new points, not at any fault of his own. But part of the point of having a top team like this feels like you should have both cars in the running. And unfortunately, for years past, we haven't seen that. We've seen all of the focus on Max being the champion, which makes sense. But what is the point of running two cars if you don't focus on, in some way, developing that second driver? And we don't know all of the inner workings on what exactly makes that second seat such a bad situation, but it is a seat that we've seen burn through so many talented drivers. And Yuki in particular is a driver that we know is at least capable of finishing in the points. He was doing well at the junior team with arguably a worse car, less resources, and so there's no reason that that talent should suddenly disappear when he gets into that second seat. It's tough to watch, and also it's hard knowing that there's probably not a seat for him next year, and that there aren't a lot of options for him to go somewhere else. A race like this one where it just seems like everything is falling apart for him, and then you have comments after the race like Christian Horner saying that the car is hard to drive, but it's not that hard, which is fair. This was a really bad performance, but it seems like there is something kind of mentally that happens when you move into that Red Bull second seat. And after Checo Perez's comments this week, I wonder how much of it is just not being supported in that second seat and constantly having pressure to perform, but not being given what you need to do so. Because at this point, it's been so many drivers that it's hard to say whether it's a single person or actually the way that that seat is being run. And then on the other side of the Red Bull camp, we have VCarb. And Liam Lawson finishes in the points, and it is the best finish of his entire F1 career. Conversely, we have Isaac Hadjar not actually make it into the points, and this was kind of a tough weekend for him. I think the comparison also helps because Liam Lawson not only did very well, but he outperformed his teammate by a large amount, and there really hasn't been a version of his weekend where that has been the case. And then another team that has this incredible performance that we were not expecting is Stake Sauber. Both of the cars finished in the points, which is an incredibly new version of this team. It's interesting to see that they're finally finding their stride, and I also wonder how much of that will transfer over to next year when the team turns into Audi. Nico Hülkenberg and Gabriel Bortoleto have this interesting dynamic that I actually really enjoy, of like older dad energy and child who is like so embarrassed but also loves him enough to keep hanging out. If you follow Kickstake Sauber on social media, you would have seen that Nico Hülkenberg did come out in a towel to congratulate Gabby on his points, and this was a really impressive performance for Gabby. I really enjoy their teammate dynamic, and I'm actually kind of interested to see if we see this team become a bit more of a contender next year. Do we see a middle ground that changes, and does Carlos Sainz regret not going with the Audi project? I do want to point out that I think for Gabby, he ended up having kind of the best run of the rookies in terms of like the way everything shakes out, because going to this team, he ends up without the same amount of pressure that a lot of the other rookies have. Kimi Antonelli goes to a top team, Isaac Hadjar is in the Red Bull camp, Ollie Behrman has this like great performance breakout moment last year and then has a lot of expectations coming in. Liam Lawson obviously has so much going on for him with the way that the actual Red Bull run happened, and then you have Gabby sort of quietly sitting in the back, getting comfortable with the car, figuring everything out, learning Formula One and what it takes to be in it, and quietly and steadily improving. And so it's exciting because he hits these points and it feels like this huge moment, as opposed to the ways some of these other rookies have had to deal with things, which is an expectation that they should already be in the points and that they should continue to do so. And so I think sometimes a slow and steady build is best for these drivers, to come in, have less pressure overall, and be able to slowly build your way up and build a foundation that is good for you. Across the board, I'm interested to see if we see Stake Sauber continue this performance, because at the beginning of this season, and of course in last season, we did not expect them to be a contender whatsoever. And while they're of course not a Constructors' Champion contender, they are starting to perform a bit better. And one thing to remember when it comes to the Constructors' Championship is the higher you finish, the more money that your team receives from the actual prize pool. So the more they can move up, the more steady they can be, the more interesting next season looks for them, and the more interesting this midfield becomes. Additionally, the Mercedes performance was just not there this week. We know that Kimi was obviously out in the first lap, but George Russell did make it to the end of the race and he finished 5th, but we saw that that car just never had the pace that it needed to. He finished so far behind his old teammate Lewis Hamilton that was essentially negligible, and so we just did not see a lot of competition at the front. Conversely, ahead of Mercedes was Ferrari, and they did very well. The pace in this car was incredibly different, though once the McLarens got into clean air, they were nowhere near catching them, but we still have this issue with driver versus engineer with Lewis Hamilton. Lewis was called in for a tire swap when he did not want to, which essentially put him in a guaranteed 4th position with no ability to try to make that podium or pass his teammate. This really just seemed to be a disagreement between driver and team, where the team had their tire strategy and just wanted to complete the race, and the driver was telling them that the tires were not spent and they should try to extend that stint for the possibility of a safety car or any other sort of situation that might have given them a free pit stop and given them a little bit of an advantage to be able to fight his own teammate. It's interesting because it depends on what the engineers actually saw. Was there a time where he could have actually caught Charles Leclerc? Did they just want to preserve 3rd and 4th and not have any sort of on-track battles that could compromise that? There are a lot of possibilities, but as always, I would prefer to see drivers really push to the limits like we watched the McLarens do. But of course, we never know exactly what's going on with the entirety of the strategy. Those cars have so much data that they give off that we don't get to see. And so there are so many possible reasons why they may have made the call. And after the race, we didn't see a lot of frustration from Lewis Hamilton. He did explain that yes, he just wanted to extend the stint and see if they could do something interesting, but there didn't really seem to be a big issue or frustration in his demeanor after the race. And Lewis Hamilton has expressed himself when he feels that there's something wrong. And also we did hear him say that while there is a great improvement that they've done, they still have work to do. Obviously, they were nowhere near catching the McLarens. But of course, we do get this podium with Charles Leclerc, which is great and ends this sort of rut that Ferrari has been in. And hopefully we see them continue on in Silverstone. And then of course, at the front of the pack, caught by no one, we have the McLarens. This on-track battle between Lando and Oscar was exactly what I was talking about last week when I said that I hoped we were going to see their battle between the two of them heat up. For the first 12 laps of this race, this was unrelenting between the two of them. Immediately, they pull away from the Ferraris and they are essentially in a race of their own. But fascinatingly, they're able to actually hold out and have this battle for 12 full laps, which at this point, I was really worried that Oscar was going to be sacrificing his tires in a way that would essentially make him completely fall away in the rest of the race. But shockingly, we really see him not have that be a situation. He's able to sit there at the back of Lando's car, really making moves for almost 12 full laps. And by the time he does end up falling back, it's because he makes this risky move. And we know later that McLaren says it was too close and too risky. And after the race, he did agree that he had taken it one step too far and that there was a possibility he could have crashed them both out, which would have obviously not been okay. It was really interesting to see the mentality shift between these two drivers from last week to this week, because last week we have Lando making these moves, really desperately hunting Oscar down and ultimately ending his own race. This week we have Lando actively and strongly defending his position this entire race. And while Oscar does eventually get past him for a moment, quickly Lando takes that position back and maintains it. He keeps that win. And I think we saw a lot of people saying like this race is going to be so spread out because of how much of a margin Lando had on pole. But again, I do think it's important to remember that qualifying that gap was so big because Oscar and Max were not able to continue their final lap. And that was because of the yellow flags caused by Pierre spinning out. So the thing is here, I think we saw this battle between the two of them where it does feel like they were in flipped positions. Lando gets away with the advantage being on pole and does get a good start, whereas Oscar is right behind him even though he starts third. And overall, I think it was so enjoyable to watch both of them really fight for this win and be allowed to race. It was certainly stressful as well, as we saw Oscar get so close and these moves get so tight, but it was also exciting to watch Lando wholeheartedly defend his first position there and to watch Oscar attempt to fight as much as he possibly could. We see the lockup, but then Lando is prioritized for the pit stop as he should have been, as he was in first position and Oscar was in second, and a pit stop strategy change really would have changed those positions by the teams doing, not by the drivers. But one thing that was really interesting was finally getting to hear both sides of the garage try to figure out how to beat the other driver. As I said, the gap on this race was so much that there was essentially one race happening between the two McLarens and then a race happening between the rest of the grid. And so it was cool to watch Lando's engineer tell him, if you do this, if you make this move, you're going to get an advantage over your teammate. And also to hear both sides of the garage giving them information on how to beat the other McLaren. This is typically a situation we just haven't been in. And instead we're actually getting to see them fully race with the full support of their team. Apart from the one moment where we hear them say that Oscar made a move that was too dangerous, the rest of this race really was up to these drivers to do. Now, there is one caveat to this, that Lando ends up winning the race, but that Franco Colapinto at one point does push Oscar off of the track. And this is in a situation where he absolutely should have moved out of the way because he was lapped. And we also get this hilarious radio message that was not broadcast where Oscar says, even after all these years, Alpine still manages to find a way to screw me over. If you're new to Formula One, you may not know that Oscar originally was with Alpine. They announced him as a driver, even though he had not agreed to be one. And then he announced that he would actually be driving for McLaren. It was a huge moment in F1 history, a huge moment of drama, and it's something that has stuck with Oscar for a long time. So the fact that it was an Alpine that pushed him off the track was sort of poetic in a bad way. But I also think, this is part of racing. You can't really take away the win from Lando and say he wouldn't have been able to continue defending Oscar if Oscar hadn't gotten pushed off the track, because again, these things happen. Also, both of them had to contend with backmarker traffic. There was a lot going on here, and we'll never know whether Oscar would have been able to overtake Lando for the win, but he probably would have caught up to him and been in DRS range for a more exciting ending to this race. But overall, for me, I was thrilled. This was great to watch the two of them and to watch Lando really be in a very different mentality, it felt like. Both of these drivers were locked in, but for the first time in a while, it felt like Oscar was the one on the back foot, and Lando was the one who was able to cross that finish line first and close that gap a little bit to that driver's title. After this race, Oscar is still in the lead for the driver's title at 216 points, but the gap to Lando is now down to 15 points, who has 201. And that gap is getting even bigger because Max ends up with no points and is still sitting in third at 155 points. So we're really getting into this place where the driver's title is starting to run away with one of these McLaren drivers, but the gap between the two of them is getting smaller and smaller. And one of the big questions and big factors that we're going to have here is how much the other drivers and the other cars can be players in this situation for the rest of the season. Not necessarily because they'll overtake either for the constructors or for the driver's title, but because if we can see some different race winners or some drivers that start to split these two McLaren drivers, where we see Lando come in first or Oscar come in first, and then another driver come in second from a different team, and then third for the other McLaren driver. Not even anything too dramatic, just a little bit of a change and a little bit of a gap. That's where we're going to really start to see those battles become really important when it comes to the driver's title. Because if they continue to just go 1-2, that gap continues to stay very, very close. If we start to see them go 1-4, 1-5, 1-3, we start to see that gap grow. Overall, I think we're getting into a place where both of these two drivers want that driver's title, have the car that could get it for them, and are being allowed by their team to race without much team orders getting in the way. And that's very exciting. This puts us in a different type of racing for the rest of the season. Because one of the things when we talk about like Red Bull dominance or Max Verstappen dominance or Lewis Hamilton dominance, people kind of talk about the fact that that was boring because one person was winning everything. And while McLaren is so dominant that, again, we are in this period where they're winning a lot, there is a difference when you have two drivers that are able to compete with each other that makes it much more exciting. So it's going to be interesting to see where the rest of the season goes. That pretty much wraps up Austria in terms of the race recap. Let's get into your questions about the race. Okay, this one made me laugh so much. Did you initially think Carlos being stuck was an F1 movie promo? I will say, as I said in the beginning, the immediate thing I thought about when this happened was the F1 movie. And it was because there are so many things in the F1 movie that feel like, oh, maybe this is a little over exaggerated, this wouldn't happen, but do reference real things that would happen and are just a heightened version of it. And I did think that this specifically was so funny because it is such a big point in the racing and the storyline of the F1 movie plot. If you've seen it, you know. If you haven't, you should. Why did Yuki have a red exclamation mark next to his name on the timing charts? This is something that's new on the graphics this year if you're watching on F1 TV. I'm not sure if this applies to ESPN and Sky Sports, but I do watch on F1 TV and I do get this graphic that this person is asking about. An exclamation point usually means that they're under investigation for a penalty that will eventually be applied. It lets you know that their timing may change, that there may be a penalty applied, and that there is an investigation ongoing. Can Lando get the WDC or is it going to be Oscars? I think either of these drivers have a real shot at this. I think we've gone back and forth. We started this season with Lando as the clear favorite. And then I think we went immediately into this world where we said, oh, Oscar's definitely going to get it and there's no way Lando could get it. And while Lando has been honest and correct that he is the one who has made more mistakes, the question is, can he, like he did this race, force mistakes on Oscar's part? And if so, that means that this championship gets closer every day. Like I said, at the end of Austria, Lando ends up cutting into that point gap. They're down to a 15-point gap, which is absolutely surmountable. First place in these races gets 25 points and second place gets 18. So that means with a 7-point gap, even if Lando and Oscar come in 1-2 for the next 3 races, if Lando takes that first position each of those 3 races, he's back on top in this championship fight. And so the answer is, yeah, either one of them can can do this. We'd have to see consistently strong performance. We have to see Lando string together a number of performances like Austria. And for me, whichever McLaren driver ends up taking it, I just want to see a good fight with a little bit of emotion and a lot of excitement on track. And that's what we got from Austria. So hopefully we continue to get it at Silverstone and beyond. That covers your questions. Let's get into predictions and discussion about Silverstone. Next race is at Silverstone, and there are a couple of interesting facts that you should know. Last time we were here at Silverstone, Lewis Hamilton won the race, ending a really long losing streak on his part. I was actually at the track, and this was one of the greatest experiences I've ever had as a fan. And so I'm excited to see what kind of performance he brings, because he's on a pretty long podium streak when it comes to Silverstone. And when we talk about home race, this is a home race for so many drivers. We have Lando Norris, George Russell, Lewis Hamilton, and Ollie Bearman that all race under the British flag. And then, of course, Alex Albon is also British, though he races under the Thai flag. So this is a pretty big race for a number of drivers. Lando will also have his first fan grandstand here, which was so popular that they built a second one. And a number of our teams look at this as their home race as well. This is a race with an extreme amount of heritage that is also celebrating their 75th year as a Formula One race. This is one of my favorite tracks and really one of my favorite races to watch. And so I'm pretty excited to see what could happen here. Could there be an upset? Could we see Lewis Hamilton on the podium? Does the Ferrari continue to have great performance? Does Lando go back to back and take his first British Grand Prix win? Or does Oscar turn around and really show up and show out here? There are so many possibilities at Silverstone, and I am so excited to see what happens. And I think overall it's going to be a fun and exciting race. We will, of course, be here and recap the race. And if you have any questions about the race and you want to have your questions or hot takes featured in the episode, make sure that you are following me on social media at Marissa Kumari. On Instagram, right after the race, I'll ask you for your questions, your hot takes, and your predictions to be included in the episode. And you can also find me on TikTok, YouTube, Snapchat, Threads, Tumblr, wherever you get your internet, I am there, and the handle is at Marissa Kumari. Also, if you have any questions about this race that I didn't cover, be sure to leave those in the comment section of this episode on YouTube. Whether you're watching this podcast on YouTube or listening on any sort of podcast app, make sure you are subscribed so that you don't miss another episode. And of course, if you don't want to watch races alone, you can always join the Grid Chat server. We watch the races live together in chat, share questions, memes, and we have our own fantasy league. And it's a great way to interact with other Formula One fans that are just here to have a good time and definitely not here to cast judgment. You can find all of these things in the links in the episode description down below. So make sure you are subscribed so that you don't miss the next episode. Drop any questions you have about Silverstone that you'd like me to cover in the race preview, and I'll see you back here for the Silverstone recap.